of 2008, or of course the recent pandemic. But the policies we see today are actually the final product of decades and decades of economic experiments, huge debates, and political battles. To really get how we got here, we have to go way back, all the way back to the beginning. So our journey starts in the 1930s. America is in the absolute grip of the Great Depression. And this wasn't just a recession. It was a crisis so big, so deep, that it forced everyone to completely rethink what the government's job even was when it came to the economy and its own people. I mean, just try to imagine this. 1 out of every 4 people who could work couldn't find a job. The entire system was on the verge of breaking down. And that old idea that, the economy would just magically fix itself, well, that was clearly not happening. Out of that desperation, a brand new way of thinking took over. The government had to do something. And this, right here, was a revolutionary shift, a total game changer. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal didn't actually create stimulus checks, but it did something arguably more important. It established the core principle that makes them possible. The idea that the government has a fundamental duty to step in and create an economic safety net for its citizens. This was the philosophical seed for absolutely everything that came after. And this philosophy wasn't just talk. It was put into action through these enormous programs. The CCC and the WPA, they put millions of people back to work on public projects. And of course, the Social Security Act created that foundational safety net for older Americans. Now, these weren't direct cash payments to everyone, but they set a massive precedent. The government could and should pump money into the economy by directly helping people. The groundwork was officially laid. Okay, so after World War II, America gets this huge boom of prosperity. But the painful lessons from the Depression were definitely not forgotten. This is when economists started to develop the actual theories, the blueprints, really, that would turn the New Deal's broad philosophy into a real policy toolkit. And the most important blueprint came from an economist you've probably heard of, John Maynard Keynes. His big idea was actually pretty simple but incredibly powerful. Consumer spending is what drives the economy. So the economy is in a nosedive. The government has to be the one to jumpstart it by spending money, even if it means going into debt, to get people spending again. It's like giving the economic engine a boost. This theory would dominate the field for decades. But as you can see, this idea took a while to evolve. The New Deal in the 30s set the stage. Then in 1964, we see the first big test of Keynesian theory with a major tax cut. But the real breakthrough moment, that came in 1975. The U.S. was facing another recession, and the government sent out a 1-year tax rebate. They didn't call it a stimulus check, but that's exactly what it was, a direct payment to households to get them to go out and spend. The modern stimulus check had just been born. So the late 20th century became this period of trial and error, because in the 1970s, a new problem popped up called stagflation. That's where you have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. It was a mess, and it really challenged those simple Keynesian models. It made policymakers realize they needed more sophisticated tools in their toolbox. There wasn't just one magic fix. And this led to the great economic debate of the 1980s. On one side, you had the demand-siders, the Keynesians, who said, give money to consumers, they'll spend it, and that will drive the economy. But on the other side, you had supply-side economics, which you might know as Reaganomics. Their idea was, no, cut taxes for businesses and the wealthy, they'll invest that money, build more stuff, and that will drive the economy. This fundamental disagreement about who to help, the consumer or the producer, really shaped policy for years. But eventually, the pendulum swung back to helping the consumer, but with a new, smarter twist: targeted stimulus. Economists and policymakers realized that lower-income families are way more likely to spend an extra dollar right away than wealthier families are. So the goal became, how do we get the most bang for our buck? Well, by sending money directly to the people who will get it back into the economy the fastest. This was a huge innovation, making stimulus more efficient. And that brings us right up to the 21st century. This is where all these theories, all these decades of debate got put to the test like never before. A series of massive global crises forced the government to act on a scale that was pretty much unimaginable, and the stimulus check finally truly came of age. The first huge test was the 2008 financial crisis. The response? The Economic Stimulus Act, which sent $96 billion out in checks to American households. And what was so important about this was that it was the first time that direct payments were the main tool in the rescue package. It was a pure, direct application of that targeted Keynesian theory.
But as we all know, the 2008 crisis was deep, and it turned out more help was needed. So just 1 year later, in 2009, came the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And look at that number, a staggering $787 billion. This was a much more complex package that mixed direct payments with big money for infrastructure projects and aid to state governments. They were fighting the crisis on every front.
And then COVID-19 hit. The global shutdown of the economy triggered a response that was absolutely historic. We saw 3 major stimulus packages in 2020 and 2021. The direct payments alone, just the checks, totaled over $867 billion. We're talking more than 476 million individual payments sent out. The sheer scale of it was just breathtaking. And what's wild is how quickly the whole system evolved in just 13 years. You can see it right here. The payments got bigger, the targeting got way more sophisticated, going from just simple income levels to using really complex data. And the technology, it went from mostly paper checks being mailed out in 2008 to near instantaneous mass direct deposits during the pandemic. With each crisis, the system got bigger, it got faster, and it got smarter. But as the checks got bigger and the tech got better, something else changed pretty dramatically: the politics. You see, that 2008 stimulus passed with pretty solid support from both parties. It was seen as a necessary emergency response. But by 2020, you could see that agreement starting to crack. And by the time the American Rescue Plan passed in 2021, support was almost entirely down party lines. The political fight to get these massive aid packages passed has gotten way, way tougher. Okay, so after this 100-year journey, all the trial and error, all the evolution, what have we actually learned? When the next crisis hits, what are the key takeaways for policymakers? Well, our history actually gives us a pretty clear roadmap. Looking back, 5 key lessons really stand out. Number 1, timing. You have to act fast because hesitating just makes the problem worse. 2, targeting. You get more impact if you get money to the people who'll spend it the fastest. 3, size matters. A small solution for a big problem just won't work. 4, technology is a game changer. Modern systems can deliver help with incredible speed. And finally, number 5, politics. You can have the best economic theory in the world, but it doesn't mean a thing if you can't get the votes to pass the bill. And really, this quote just gets to the absolute heart of it all. When you strip away all the economic jargon and the political debates, this 100-year story has really been about one thing: finding better and faster ways to help real people get through a crisis. It's about providing some stability when everything feels like it's falling apart. So, where does the story go from here? Well, it's definitely not over. Economists are already talking about things like automatic stimulus, payments that would trigger automatically based on economic data, with no political debate needed. They're talking about digital currencies that could make payments happen literally in an instant. As our world keeps changing, you can bet the tools we use to protect our economy will keep changing too. The next chapter is already being written. Straight to the facts on stimulus money. You've got questions. Is more on the way? How much could it be? And what does it all really mean for you? Well, let's break it down nice and simple. Okay, let's just dive right into the big one, right? This is the question that's on everybody's mind. It's probably why you're here. And you know what? I'm not going to make you wait for the answer. Every time things feel a little shaky out there, this is the question that pops up. So, what's the deal? And there it is. The straight, honest-to-goodness truth is not yet. Right now, as we speak, no new federal stimulus checks have been approved. There's no bill, no money in the mail. But, and this is a really big but, that is not where the story ends. Not even close. The government has sent out stimulus money before, and the exact same reasons they did it then, well, they could definitely happen again. So the real question isn't just if, it's when, and what are the signs we should all be looking out for? So how do we spot the shift? How do we know when the conversation goes from not yet to it's coming? Well, it turns out there are some really clear signals. You can think of them like an economic weather forecast. No one's got a crystal ball, but history shows us there are specific things that happen that get politicians talking seriously about sending out more checks. So, what are these triggers? It really boils down to 4 main signals. First, you've got to keep an eye on the unemployment rate. If that number starts to creep up towards, say, 6 or even 7%, that's a huge red flag. Then there's just a general significant slowdown in the economy. The third, politics, of course. An election year always ramps up the pressure. And finally, maybe the most powerful one, public pressure. When enough people start demanding help, Washington eventually has to listen. Okay, so we know the signs to look for, but let's get down to the why. Why does stimulus checks even happen in the first place? It's not just some random giveaway. It's a very specific tool that economists use to stop a really dangerous problem, what they call a vicious economic cycle. So let's take a look at what that actually is. This right here is the dangerous downward spiral that keeps economists up at night. It's a feedback loop. See, it all starts when folks have less money in their pockets. Naturally, they stop buying as much stuff. Well, that directly hurts businesses, right? So what do? They have to lay people off. And that, of course, means even more people have less money. And you can see how the cycle just keeps feeding on itself, pulling the entire economy down. So how do you stop a spiral like that? Well, a stimulus check is designed to be like a wrench thrown into the gears of that cycle. By putting cash directly into millions of bank accounts, the government is basically hitting the reset button. The whole idea is that you'll take that money and spend it right away on things you need: groceries, gas, rent, and that spending goes straight to businesses, which helps them keep the lights on and, crucially, keep their employees on the payroll. It's all about turning that vicious cycle into a virtuous one.
All right, now for the part I know you've been waiting for. If, and that's still an if, another round of stimulus happens, how much money are we really talking about here? The good news is we don't have to just pull a number out of thin air. We can actually look back at the past payments, and believe me, a very clear pattern starts to show up. This timeline really tells the whole story, doesn't it? Back in 2008, the payments were pretty modest. But look at what happened during the pandemic. They grew, and they grew significantly. We went from $1,200 in 2020 all the way up to $1,400 for every single person in a household in late 2021. The pattern is kind of undeniable. When the government decides to act, the trend has been to go bigger and bigger. Let's just sit with this number for a second. $5,600. That is what a family of four got in that single largest round of stimulus. Think about what that actually means for a real family. For a lot of people, that's 4, maybe 5 months of rent. That could be an entire year of car payments. It could be months and months of groceries and bills. We're not talking about a little boost here. We're talking about a genuine lifeline. It's breathing room. That's the kind of real-world impact these numbers have. So why the big jump in the payment amounts? Well, it all comes down to this kind of wonky economic idea called the marginal propensity to consume. Don't worry, it sounds way more complicated than it is. All it really means is this. If I give you an extra dollar, are you more likely to spend it or save it? And what all the studies show is that people with less in savings, people living paycheck to paycheck, they spend that money like immediately. For a stimulus to work, the government needs that money out in the economy now. And that's why they go big. A $1,400 check is much more likely to get spent on immediate needs than a smaller $600 one. It's just that simple. This brings us to another super important question. If checks do go out, who actually gets one? And one of the most consistent things we've seen is that these programs tend to be incredibly broad. The whole point is to get money flowing fast, and the easiest way to do that is to include just about everybody. So here's the good news. Usually the eligibility is really, really wide. It's not just for people who are unemployed. Working folks, retirees, people on disability, they've all typically qualified in the past. The main target is the broad middle class. So unless you're a really high income earner, chances are you'd be on the list. And what about how fast you get the money? Because let's be real, if you need help, you need it now, not months from now. And thankfully, this is where the system has gotten so much better. Back in 2008, it took months to get paper checks in the mail. Fast forward to 2021, and the IRS was getting money into people's bank accounts via direct deposit within days of a law being signed. That's a huge improvement. Okay, so we've talked about the why, the when, the how much, and the who. But here's the thing. You don't just have to sit back and wait to see what happens. There are actual concrete things you can do right now to make sure you're ready to go if and when another payment gets approved. Let's walk through your action plan. Look, it's a simple 4-step plan. This is all about being proactive instead of reactive. It puts you in the best possible spot. And let's kick it off with what I think is the most important practical step of all, just being ready. These 3 things seem small, but they are incredibly powerful. First, make sure the IRS has your current mailing address. More importantly, check that your direct deposit information, your bank account info, is up to date. That's the secret to getting paid in days instead of weeks. And finally, file your taxes. I know, nobody likes doing it, but even if you don't owe a dime, filing gets you into the IRS system, so any future payments can be sent to you automatically.
Whew, we have covered a ton of ground here, right? We've looked at the economic signs, the history, the politics, and the practical steps you can take. So after all of that, let's circle all the way back to the beginning and ask one more time, what's the real bottom line here? And here it is, plain and simple. It really just comes down to two things: need and pressure. If those economic warning lights we talked about, like rising unemployment, start flashing red, the need for help will be obvious. And if enough of us are feeling that pain and make our voices heard, the political pressure will be impossible to ignore. And when those two things come together, history tells us that more checks become not just a possibility, but a probability. And you know, this might be the most important takeaway of all. It is so easy to get caught up waiting and hoping for help to arrive. But this idea right here, this puts the power right back where it belongs, with you. A stimulus check can be a huge help, an absolute lifeline, but it's not a long-term plan. So the real question I want to leave you with is this: what's one thing you can do this week, stimulus or not, to take control and build a stronger financial future for yourself?
What if, instead of sending checks to almost everyone, we sent out fewer checks but made them way more powerful? We're talking about ongoing, monthly payments, but, and this is the key part, only for a very specific group of people. Let's get into it. All right, first up, let's just take a second and think back to 2020 and 2021. Remember those 3 big stimulus checks? A lot of us got them, and for some people, they were an absolute lifeline. But the big question this new report is asking is, was that really the best way to do it? Could we have gotten a bigger economic bang for our buck, with fewer negative side effects?
So the approach back then was, well, it was broad. I mean, incredibly broad. We're talking about checks going out to something like 85% of the entire U.S. population. The idea was pretty simple, right? Just get money into as many hands as possible, as fast as possible. But, as this report points out, that kind of blanket approach, it came with a massive kind of hidden cost.
And what was that cost? Well, in a word, inflation. According to this study, printing and just sending out trillions of dollars to almost everyone is a huge reason we saw that crazy inflation and all the supply chain chaos. The report uses a great analogy. It was like flooding an engine. Just too much, too fast, all at once. So if that didn't work perfectly, what's the alternative? Okay, so to really get what this new proposal is all about, we got to wrap our heads around one core economic idea. And it's actually pretty simple. It's this: not every dollar is spent the same way. The way different people use a new dollar they get, well, that's the whole secret to making a stimulus plan actually work.
All right, so here's the fancy economic term for it: marginal propensity to consume, or MPC for short. Now I know, that sounds super complicated, but I promise it's not. It really just boils down to one simple question. If I handed you an extra dollar right now, what would you do with it? Would you spend it right away on groceries, gas, bills, or would you stick it in your savings account? That one little concept, that's the foundation for this whole new way of thinking about stimulus.
So this study kind of breaks people down into 3 main groups based on this MPC idea. First up, you've got your high MPC folks. These are generally lower income people who, look, when they get an extra buck, it's got to go right back out the door for necessities. Then you've got the medium MPC group. This is often your middle income crowd. They'll spend some of it, for sure, but they're probably going to save a good chunk of it too. And finally, you have the low MPC group. These are your high income individuals. An extra dollar for them, it's much, much more likely to get saved or invested instead of spent. So you see the pattern, right? The more money you make, the less likely you are to immediately spend the next dollar you get. And this right here, this is really the heart of the matter. A stimulus check, it isn't supposed to be a gift. The whole point is right there in the name, to stimulate the economy. And for that to happen, what needs to happen? The money has to be spent. It has to move. And as you can see, giving a dollar to someone in that high MPC group, well, you get the most bang for your buck immediately. Over 80 cents of that dollar goes right back into the economy. That effect gets smaller and smaller with the other groups. So the bottom line is pretty clear. If you want maximum stimulus, you got to give the money to the people who are going to spend it.
Okay, so now that we've got this MPC thing down, we can look at the actual plan this report is proposing for the next time the economy takes a nosedive. And it is a radically different approach. It's laser-focused, super efficient, and, they argue, way more powerful.
And the big number at the center of this whole thing? $2,000. But get this, it's not a one-time check. The proposal is for $2,000 a month, an ongoing payment designed to create real stability and a continuous flow of spending into the economy.
Now here's the crucial part. This is not for everyone. The plan is super targeted. It's aimed specifically at low-income and fixed-income folks. Think people on Social Security, disability, SSI, and VA benefits. And why them? Well, it's exactly what we just talked about. This is the high MPC group. These are the people who will take that money and, out of necessity, immediately put it back into the economy. And it's not a forever thing either. It's designed as a temporary fix, just for a few months during a really bad recession, to basically jumpstart the economic engine.
So you might be asking, okay, what's the big advantage of this laser-focused approach? Well, it's simple. You get a much bigger bang for your buck, a much bigger economic impact for a surprisingly smaller price tag. It's really about being strategic, instead of just dropping cash from a helicopter and hoping for the best.
Let's just compare these two approaches side by side, because this really puts it all into perspective. The old way checks to 85% of the country, costing nearly $1 trillion. And the result, the report argues, was a ton of inflation. The new proposal, you target a much smaller group, maybe 50 to 100 million people, the ones who need it the most and will spend it the fastest. The total cost? A few $100 billion. So you get a faster, more direct boost to the economy, you help the people who are most vulnerable, and you do it all for a fraction of the cost and with way, way less risk of causing that crazy inflation.
Okay, now I have to be super clear about this next part. This is really important. As fascinating as this idea is, right now it is just that, an idea, a proposal. This is not a current government policy.
In fact, the report itself says it directly, and I'm quoting here, a $2,000 check has not been approved right now. So I just want to make sure everyone understands, this is a research paper, it's not an active program you can sign up for.
So what's the point of all this then? Well, the real value here isn't about a check that's coming in the mail tomorrow. The value is that this is a potential blueprint for the future. It's a detailed, data-driven game plan that policymakers can look at the next time we hit a big economic crisis. It's really all about learning from what happened last time so we can have a smarter, better, and less damaging response in the future.
And that really leaves us with one big final question to think about. Instead of these huge, broad, one-size-fits-all solutions, could this be the future? Is this kind of smart, targeted, data-driven support the new way we handle economic recovery? This report, for one, makes a really compelling case that it just might be.
Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not just going to talk about stimulus money. We're going to talk about strategy. We're going to turn all that uncertainty into a solid game plan so you can absolutely maximize the benefit from any economic relief program that might come your way.
For so many of us, getting a government stimulus check can feel, well, it can feel like a game of chance, right? You hear some rumors, you're glued to the news, and you basically just sit there and hope for the best. It feels like it's all just luck and timing that you have zero control over. But what if I told you it's a lot more like a game of chess than just a random roll of the dice? What if by actually understanding the board and knowing the rules, you could get a serious advantage, not just in getting the money, but in making it work for you for the long haul? That is the exact game plan we're going to build together, starting right now. Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to talk about what it means to win the stimulus game. Then, we'll get into understanding the rules. After that, we'll cover proactive preparation, how to maximize what you get, and finally, how you can become a true stimulus champion. First up, winning the stimulus game. This is all about making that critical mental shift, moving from being a passive person waiting for things to happen to being an active, strategic player in control. Believe it or not, these stimulus programs follow some surprisingly predictable patterns. Getting a handle on these 4 core rules is your first and honestly your most powerful strategic advantage. So let's break them down. This right here, this demystifies the whole thing. First, timing. The money gets sent out in waves. Direct deposits are always the fastest, sometimes hitting your account within a week. But paper checks and those debit cards, that can take weeks, maybe even months. Knowing this helps you manage your cash flow. Second, amounts. They almost always follow a formula. A base amount, maybe $1,200, maybe $1,400, plus extra for any dependents. This lets you kind of sketch out a budget before you even know for sure. Third, eligibility. This almost always comes down to your adjusted gross income from your most recent tax return. That one number is what decides if you qualify. And finally, distribution. Look, having your direct deposit info updated with the IRS is the #1 best way to get paid fast. Period. These aren't secrets. They're literally the rules of the game. So knowing the rules is one thing, but actually acting on them, that's what takes us to the next super critical phase, proactive preparation. This is how you get all your pieces in place before the game even starts. It's what separates the pros from the amateurs. So this slide lays it out perfectly. There are two kinds of players. Which one are you? The reactive recipient waits for the news, then scrambles when they realize their check is going to an old bank account. They're always reacting to problems. But the strategic player? They anticipate. They see the writing on the wall, they keep their info updated every year just as a habit, and they already have a plan for the money before it even shows up. One is constantly playing defense, always a step behind. The other is playing offense, ready for whatever comes next.
And that preparation, it's really built on these three pillars. Financial prep is your foundation. You've got to file your taxes every single year, even if you don't owe anything. This puts you on the grid. It makes sure they have your current info. Knowledge prep is all about intelligence gathering. You start watching for economic triggers, like a jump in unemployment or a drop in the GDP. That's just the total value of everything a country produces. These are the signals that often come before any stimulus talks. And community prep is your network. Get in touch with local nonprofits or community groups. They often know about local programs and can help you avoid scams.
All right, you've played your opening moves perfectly. The money has arrived. Now, this is where the real strategy begins. How to maximize winnings isn't just about getting the check. It's about using it to create real, lasting improvement in your financial life.
So, what is the smartest way to actually use this money? This framework is your guide. Notice that about half of it goes to immediate needs, food, rent, keeping the lights on, that's crucial. But the other half is for building your future. A good chunk, maybe 20 to 30%, should go to debt reduction. Attack that high-interest credit card debt first. Paying that down is like giving yourself a raise. Another 20 to 30% is for strategic investments. This could be anything from a certification class to a car repair that you need to get to work, or just starting a small emergency fund. And yeah, that last little slice for quality of life, that's important too. Reducing stress is a huge part of long-term financial health. This timeline tells you exactly when to make each move. Right now, in the pre-crisis phase, you should be making sure your info is up to date. When you see those early warnings in the economy, you start paying close attention. During the legislative debate, you start drafting your spending plan based on what they're talking about. Once a bill passes, you're in the distribution phase, verifying everything on official government sites. Once you get the money, you receipt and maximize by putting your plan into action. And then, and this is key, post-stimulus, you don't stop. You use that breathing room to keep building resilience, because these economic cycles, well, they always come back around.
Okay. Finally, let's talk about the end game, becoming a stimulus champion. This isn't about just winning once. It's about adopting a mindset that lets you navigate these situations successfully every single time, and maybe even help others do it too.
This winning mindset really has 4 parts. It starts with being proactive, not reactive. It grows when you're strategic, thinking a few moves ahead. But what really makes a champion is being community-focused. When you share good, verified info with your friends and family, when you shut down misinformation you see online, you're making your whole community stronger. When you become that trusted source of info, that leader, you're not just helping yourself play the game better, you're helping everyone win. And really, in the end, it all comes down to this single idea. The exact same payment can be a temporary band-aid for one person, or it can be a stepping stone to real financial stability for another. The difference isn't luck, it's strategy, it's preparation, and it's choice. By playing the game smart, you can make sure that for you, it's always a tool for lasting improvement.
Let's talk about stimulus checks. They're probably one of the most powerful and, yeah, one of the most controversial tools a government has in its toolkit. When a crisis hits, all of a sudden we're talking about billions, sometimes trillions of dollars meant to save the economy. But does it actually work? Today, we're going to dig into the data and get to the honest truth.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole thing. Are these checks a desperate lifeline for families who are just trying to keep their heads above water? A necessary shot in the arm for the economy? Or are they a huge liability, a short-term fix that ends up causing bigger problems down the road, like debt and inflation? It's a massive question, and the answer, well, it's definitely not simple. So you've really got 2 camps here. On one side, people are saying these checks are absolutely essential. They stop the economy from collapsing and prevent widespread suffering. On the other side, you've got critics saying they're just reckless handouts that make problems like inflation way worse. The thing is, both sides have a point. So let's unpack the data and see what it tells us. First, let's look at the case for stimulus. Because, when these programs are done right, they can be incredibly effective. So what does getting it right actually look like? The first thing, and maybe the most important factor of all, is speed. In an economic emergency, you got to think of it like being a first responder. The help has to get there right now, not weeks or months later when all the damage is already done. Getting that money into people's hands fast is absolutely critical. Just look at the CARES Act back in 2020. The law was signed on March 27th, and just 2 weeks later, only 14 days, money was already hitting people's bank accounts. For the government, that is lightning fast. And the effect was almost immediate. By May, you could see consumer spending pull out of a complete nosedive. That speed almost certainly prevented a much, much deeper economic collapse. Okay, so speed is one huge piece of the puzzle, but who gets the money? That is just as important. What we call targeting efficiency is all about making sure the stimulus goes to the people who are most likely to turn around and spend it immediately. That's what creates a real ripple effect through the economy. And this is where you can actually see that ripple effect in the data. Look at this. Households that had less than $500 in the bank, they spent almost half of their stimulus check within just 10 days. Now compare that to households with over $3,000 in savings. They spent basically nothing. It just goes to show you the exact same dollar has a radically different impact depending on whose pocket it ends up in. All right, the next piece is scale. A stimulus can be fast, it can be well-targeted, but if it's just too small, it's like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. Let's compare what happened in 2008 to what happened in 2020. The 2008 checks were smaller, and the total package was only $96 billion. The general feeling now was that it just wasn't big enough for the size of the crisis. Fast forward to 2020, the CARES Act was almost 3 times that size, which was much closer to what the economy actually needed. And finally, you have to remember that stimulus checks don't work in a vacuum. The 2020 response wasn't just about sending out cash. It was a full-on, multi-pronged attack on the crisis. You had enhanced unemployment, you had support for businesses with the PPP loans, protections against eviction. All of these things were working together. A crisis hits families from every direction, so the solution has to, too. But that, of course, is only half the story. These programs have some very real downsides, and it is crucial that we understand why they sometimes fail. So, just like good timing is a key to success, bad timing can be a fatal flaw. But it's not just about being slow, it's about when the stimulus actually shows up in relation to what the economy is doing. If it arrives too late in the game, it can be almost useless. And the 2008 stimulus is really the classic example of this. The checks went out in the early summer of that year. But the absolute worst part of the crisis, the Lehman Brothers collapse, the whole market meltdown, that didn't happen until September and October. So by the time the economy was in total freefall, the impact from those stimulus checks had already vanished. The timing was just completely wrong. The flip side of getting money to the right people is, of course, getting it to the wrong people. When stimulus money goes to folks who don't really need it or aren't going to spend it, that economic impact is just massively reduced. That money is way more likely to just get saved or maybe used to pay down some debt, which doesn't really do much to stimulate immediate economic activity. And, the data from the pandemic really backs this up. High-income households, they saved a whopping 40% of their stimulus payments. That is a huge amount of money that was just put on the sidelines instead of being put back into the economy. It's stimulus money that isn't really stimulating much of anything. Another major reason these things can fail is the system itself. If a program is just too complicated, if it's hard to get to or difficult to even understand, it's pretty much guaranteed to fail the most vulnerable people. The very people it was designed to help in the first place. And this is where policy slams right into reality. Despite all the good intentions, an estimated 8 to 12 million eligible Americans never even got their first stimulus check. And the reasons why are pretty simple and pretty painful. No internet, language barriers, or just not having a bank account. It's a tough reminder that a program is only as good as its ability to actually reach the people who need it. And then, of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, inflation. The U.S. government spent around $5 trillion on pandemic relief. That is just an unprecedented amount of money. And while the debate is really complex, a lot of economists argue that pumping that much cash into the economy was basically like pouring gasoline on the inflationary fire that we all felt at the grocery store and the gas pump. So we've seen the clear wins and we've seen the clear failures. But the reality is most stimulus policy lives somewhere in a messy gray area. It's not really about right and wrong. It's about navigating a series of incredibly difficult trade-offs. So let me just ask you this, right? What's the better choice? Getting money out the door as fast as humanly possible, even though you know some of it's going to be messy, it might go to the wrong people or even fraudsters? Or do you take the time to build a slow, perfect system that gets every single dollar to the right person, but might show up way too late? There is no easy answer to that.
And these are the core dilemmas. This is what policymakers are constantly forced to choose between. Do you want speed or do you want accuracy? Do you want to reach absolutely everyone or only those who need it most? Do you provide generous relief right now or do you protect the country's long-term finances? Every single one of those choices means sacrificing something else.
But here's the thing. When policymakers manage to navigate these trade-offs correctly, the payoff can be huge. Studies show that for every $1 that gets into a low-income household, it actually generates about $1.50 in economic activity. That's that economic multiplier effect right there, a really powerful return on investment. And beyond the pure economics of it, there's a profound human impact here. The 2020 stimulus checks, for all their flaws, are credited with cutting the overall poverty rate by 10% in a single year. That's a staggering achievement. It literally kept millions of families, especially families with kids, from falling into poverty during a historic crisis.
So, with all of this in mind, how do we get it right the next time? Because let's be honest, there will be a next time. Here's what the lessons from the past can teach us about designing smarter stimulus programs for the future. The path forward is really about being prepared. First, we need to create automatic triggers so help goes out the second a recession hits, without all the political delays. Second, we have to invest in the basic government plumbing, the infrastructure to get money out quickly and accurately. Third, we have to design these programs from day one to balance speed with accuracy. Fourth, the approach has to be comprehensive, tackling jobs, housing, and individual support all at once. And finally, every emergency plan needs an exit strategy to make sure we're not damaging our long-term financial health.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about spreadsheets and economic models. It's about our shared responsibility when things get tough. It's about preventing suffering. You know, the hard-earned lessons from the past have shown us what's possible, and they've shown us what can go wrong. The real question for the future isn't if we'll face another crisis, but if we'll be wise enough to build a better bridge before we actually need it.
You know, there's a question that just keeps popping up, and I see it everywhere. Are we going to get a fourth stimulus check? It's a huge topic online, and honestly, for very good reason. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and really look at what the economy itself is telling us. So let's just get right to it. This is the question on everybody's mind. And listen, while there's tons of speculation out there, the real answer isn't buried in some political headline. Nope. It's found in the economic data. And that's not an exaggeration. We're talking about this today because for millions of people who are really feeling the financial squeeze, this isn't just some abstract idea. It's a very real daily concern. So let's try to get some real clarity. All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with what actually triggers these payments. Then we'll look at a pretty surprising pattern from the past. After that, we'll zero in on the one economic number you need to keep an eye on. And finally, we'll talk about why the next stimulus might look totally different from the last one. Okay, first things first. What actually causes a stimulus check to happen in the first place? It's not random, and it's not just politics. It is a direct, calculated response to one specific event, an economy that's gotten sick. And when we say the economy is sick, we're really talking about a recession. That's the official word for it, right? A major, widespread, and kind of prolonged downturn that hits everything and everyone, from big corporations to your local coffee shop. And this right here is the core idea we need to understand. If you just look back at the last couple of decades, the pattern is crystal clear. Every single major recession has been followed by stimulus checks. Every single time. It's basically become a standard move in the modern economic playbook. Here's a great way to think about it. Imagine the economy is a patient. A recession? That's when the patient gets seriously ill. The lawmakers are the doctors, and their go-to prescription is a big old injection of cash. That's the stimulus, to try and get the patient back up and running. And it makes sense, right? The sicker the patient, the bigger the dose of medicine they're going to need. So let's dig into that history a little bit, because when you actually examine the numbers from past recessions, well, a really fascinating and maybe even predictive pattern starts to show up. Okay, check this out. Back in 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, the check was for $300. Then in 2008, during that massive financial crisis, it doubled to $600. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, it doubled again to $1,200. Are you seeing the pattern here? Now, if you just follow that doubling logic, the next number in that sequence would be around $2,400.
But, and I have to be super clear about this is just an observation of a historical trend. It is absolutely not a guarantee. The actual amount of any future check would depend completely on how severe the economic downturn is at the time. So if a sick economy is the trigger, how do we know when it's sick enough for the doctors to step in? Well, there's one key health report that we can all look at. It comes out on the first Friday of every single month, and it's simply called the Jobs Report.
And inside this report, there are a few vital signs. You've got the headline number, the unemployment rate. But just as important is jobs created or lost. Are companies hiring, or are they laying people off? The labor participation rate tells us how many people are even trying to find a job. And average hourly earnings shows if our paychecks are keeping pace with inflation. Altogether, they paint a pretty clear picture of our economic health. So when you start to see that businesses, from the giant corporations all the way down to your local pizzeria, are slowing down their hiring, or worse, starting to let people go, that is a massive warning flare for the whole economy. It means people aren't spending as much, companies are getting nervous, and the whole economic engine is starting to sputter. That is the signal that gets lawmakers to scramble and start seriously talking about what they need to do. But, and this is really important, if they do act again, there's a good chance it won't be a carbon copy of last time. The whole strategy could shift to something much more targeted.
See, the last few checks were broad. They went out to a massive chunk of the population. A targeted strategy is different. It would focus laser-like on low-income and fixed-income households. Why? Because those are the folks most likely to spend the money immediately and pump it right back into the economy. This gives you way more bang for your buck, and it does it with less risk of driving up inflation for everybody else. So the big takeaway here is this. We might need to adjust our expectations. If and when another stimulus package comes along, it could be designed very, very differently, maybe aimed at a smaller group of people to get the maximum economic impact with the fewest negative side effects.
Okay, so let's just trace that path one more time. It starts with an economic contraction. We see it in those bad jobs reports. That triggers the lawmakers' scramble, where they have to respond. Then a stimulus package is passed, and finally, the payments are distributed with one single goal: to get spent right away and kickstart the economy.
So that brings us to the final thought. Based on modern history, it really doesn't seem to be a matter of if the government will intervene in the next major recession. The real question is, how sick does the economy have to get before they open up that playbook once again? That's what we'll all be watching. You ever check your bank account and see a surprise deposit from the US Treasury and just think, where in the world did that come from? You know, a stimulus check can feel like it just materializes out of thin air. But the journey it takes from being a far-off idea to actually landing in your wallet, well, that's one of the most complex, high-stakes dramas in all of Washington. It's this wild path that twists through economic theory, bare-knuckle political fights, and some absolutely incredible logistical challenges. So let's pull back the curtain and really follow the money from the first whisper of a crisis to the very moment it hits your account. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We're going to trace this whole journey through 5 key stages. First, we'll look at what kind of emergency actually sparks the idea in the first place. Then, we'll meet the major players whose decisions really matter. After that, we'll dive into the treacherous legislative process a bill has to survive. We'll see how that law becomes actual cash. And finally, we'll look ahead and explore what the future of this kind of economic relief might hold. So, first things first, stimulus checks don't just get handed out on a whim. Think of them less like a, hey, here's a good idea, and more like an emergency tool. They're like the financial fire extinguisher the government only smashes the glass for when the whole economic house is on fire. These things are born from moments of serious national distress, when the normal flow of the economy is so broken that a direct, pretty drastic intervention is seen as maybe the only option left. Okay, so what does that distress actually look like? What are the specific signals Washington needs to see before the gears even start to turn on something like a stimulus plan? I can tell you, it takes a lot more than just a few bad headlines or a dip in the stock market. The economic pain has to be so widespread, so severe, that it can actually overcome the natural state of political gridlock. It has to be a genuine, you can't deny it crisis. And what's really fascinating is just how specific these triggers are. This isn't just about a gut feeling.
Policymakers and economists are literally watching a dashboard of precise indicators. So when the unemployment rate starts climbing past that 6 or 7% mark, that is a huge, blaring red flag. It means millions of people are losing their jobs and their ability to spend money. Then there's the GDP, the gross domestic product, basically the total value of everything made in the country. If that shrinks for 6 straight months, 2 quarters in a row, we're technically in a recession. But really, the biggest catalysts are those seismic black swan events. Think a global pandemic like in 2020 or a massive banking collapse in 2008. These are things that shock the entire system all at once. And underneath all of that, they're watching consumer confidence. When people get too scared to spend, the whole economy can just freeze up. And that's the exact moment when putting cash directly into people's hands goes from being some theoretical idea to an urgent necessity. So once all those alarm bells start ringing, the focus immediately shifts from why we need help to who can make it happen. You see, an idea for a stimulus check is totally worthless without the key institutions and the people running them to drag it into reality. This is where the real power brokers of Washington step onto the stage, and each one has a critical part to play. You can almost think of it like a 4-part relay race. First up, you've got the president, who's like the starting runner. Now, he can't write the check himself, but he has what's called the bully pulpit, this unique power to get the entire nation's attention, propose a big plan, and put a ton of public pressure on Congress. Then, the baton gets passed to Congress, which holds the ultimate authority here, the constitutional power of the purse. No money gets spent with their sign-off. And the real heavy lifting happens in key committees, like the House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committees. Once they, hopefully, pass a bill, the third runner, that's the Treasury Department and the IRS, takes over. They have the absolutely monumental task of turning legal text into actual money in millions of bank accounts. And all the while, running in a parallel lane, is the Federal Reserve. They don't handle the checks directly, but their decisions on interest rates and the money supply, well, they create the entire economic environment that makes a stimulus necessary in the first place. So, the crisis is here, the key players are at the table, and an idea is starting to take shape. Now comes the hardest part, forcing that idea through this grueling obstacle course that we call the legislative gauntlet. And trust me, this is not a simple vote. It is a brutal process of negotiation, compromise, and political warfare that, frankly, most proposals just do not survive. This whole journey is just a series of make-or-break hurdles. It all kicks off with a formal proposal, which might come from the White House or from members of Congress themselves. That proposal gets sent immediately to a committee for review. And this is really the first kill point. If it makes it out of committee, it moves to the floor of the House or the Senate for a full debate and a vote. But here's the tricky part. Both the House and the Senate have to pass the exact same bill. This is what often forces a conference committee, where leaders from both sides get in a room to hammer out a compromise. Only if they can agree does a final bill land on the president's desk for a signature, which then finally kicks off that last step, implementation. You know those grand speeches you see on TV, on C-SPAN? Forget about them. Most of that is just for show. The real nitty-gritty work of making a law happens right here, in the committee rooms. This is where the messy, unglamorous sausage-making takes place. Lawmakers debate every single tiny detail. Should the check be $1,200 or $2,000? What's the income cutoff for who's eligible? Do kids count? And if they do, for how much? Amendments are proposed, experts are brought in to testify, and the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office comes in and slaps a price tag on the whole thing. It is a meticulous and often brutal process where the final bill is really forged. But there is one force that's powerful enough to blast through all this gridlock: overwhelming public opinion. During the pandemic, support for direct payments was consistently over 70%. I mean, that is a staggering number in a country as divided as ours. When a policy is that popular, it creates a political tidal wave. It gives politicians cover to vote yes, even if they have some private worries about the cost or the details. No elected official wants to be the one seen voting against sending direct help to their constituents when a massive majority is demanding action. Public pressure becomes the ultimate lubricant for the rusty gears of Washington. Okay, so the bills survive the gauntlet. The president's signature is on the paper. The political fight in Washington is finally over, right? Not even close. Now a totally different kind of war begins, a logistical battle against time, technology, and pure complexity. It's the sheer nightmare of getting money from the U.S. Treasury into the hands of over 100 million Americans. And what's really remarkable is seeing the government's steep learning curve in action. If you look back to 2008, that whole process dragged on for about 2 months. But then, flash forward to 2020.
Faced with the crazy urgency of the pandemic, that massive CARES Act went from a proposal to a law in about 3 weeks. I mean, that is just unprecedented speed. And by 2021, the system had become this well-oiled machine. The law passed quickly, and payments started hitting bank accounts almost instantly. What that really reflects is a huge behind-the-scenes investment in the digital infrastructure needed to move massive amounts of money fast.
But fast definitely does not mean easy. I mean, think about it. The IRS has to sift through data for tens of millions of people, cross-referencing tax returns and Social Security files, just to figure out who gets a check and for how much. Then they have to process this incredible volume of payments, a technical feat that strains their systems to the absolute breaking point. All the while, they're fighting a constant battle against fraud, because scammers see this as a golden opportunity to prey on people. And just as importantly, the government has to communicate clearly. Any confusion about who's eligible or when the money is coming creates a huge wave of public anxiety and just floods their phone lines, which slows everything down. It is a monumental, monumental challenge.
So all of this experience, the successes, the failures, the struggles, it hasn't been wasted. Policymakers are now looking to the future and asking a really critical question. How can we do this better next time? The lessons we've learned from the last few crises are actively shaping the debate about how to make this powerful tool faster, smarter, and way more effective. And this brings us to a really fascinating potential evolution in how we think about stimulus. Traditionally, the whole process has been reactive, right? We wait for an economic disaster to hit, and then we scramble to pass a law, wasting precious weeks or even months. A future system could be automatic. Just imagine a world where, as soon as unemployment hits a certain percentage, payments are triggered automatically, with no political fight needed. Past stimulus has also been very broad, basically one-size-fits-all checks. Future relief could be way more targeted, using real-time data to send more money to the specific people and communities that are hurting the most. By combining these ideas with an even faster digital payment system, we could move from a process that takes weeks to one that delivers relief in just days. You know, it is so easy to get lost in all the Washington jargon, the committees, the votes, the budget scores, the political strategy, but it's so important to remember what this is all truly about. Behind every single legislative battle and every logistical headache are real families just trying to pay their rent, buy groceries, and keep the lights on during a crisis. The entire complex, messy, and frankly frustrating process we've just walked through, it's ultimately designed for one simple purpose: to provide a financial lifeline when people need it the most. And so we end with this really critical question for the future. We've seen just how powerful this tool can be, but we've also seen how messy and political the whole process is. Could a system of automatic, highly targeted payments be a smarter, more efficient way to fight the next recession? It would probably mean less political infighting and much faster help, but it would also mean handing over some control to economic data and algorithms. It's a fascinating debate, and honestly, the answer is going to shape how we respond to economic crises for decades to come. You ever wonder what it would actually take for another stimulus check to be sent out? Well, the answer might surprise you. It's not really about politics. It's all about economic data. So today, let's break down the dominoes that have to fall for that to happen. All right, let's just dive right into the biggest question of all. It seems kind of backward, right? But the answer is, yeah. A weaker economy has always been the single biggest trigger for widespread government stimulus. Let's get into why that is. Okay, first things first. We have to understand why this topic even keeps coming up. I mean, it's not just people being curious. For millions, this question is a direct reflection of their own wallets right now. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? This is the kind of thing you see in comment sections everywhere. When people are really struggling just to cover the basics, that whole conversation about financial relief, well, it gets really loud and it gets really constant. This is probably the most crucial thing to get. Yeah, stimulus checks are passed by politicians, but they're not really a political tool. A better way to think of them is like an economic emergency brake. You know, you only pull that lever when the whole system is slowing down fast and needs a serious jolt to get going again. So that brings us to the trigger itself. What does a weak economy actually look like on paper, in terms of the data? And how do those numbers signal to lawmakers that, hey, maybe it's time to step in? This chart lays it out perfectly. It's like two sides of the same coin. On the left, you've got all the signs of a healthy, humming economy. But on the right, those are the alarm bells. When economists see a big nationwide shift from the left column to the right column, especially that jump in unemployment and a drop in spending, that's the signal. That's when you know the economy is in trouble, and the talk about intervention really starts. You know, this whole cycle of the economy tanking and then lawmakers scrambling to do something, it led a few of them to float a pretty radical idea. What if the help just happened automatically?
The idea was called automatic stabilizers. And you can just think of it like a simple if-then command for the economy. If unemployment hits a certain number, then relief payments are automatically sent out. The whole goal was to get money into people's hands way faster by cutting out the slow, messy legislative part. Now, the downside is less oversight, but the focus was on speed. Now, this proposed system gives us a really clear window into how policymakers think about this stuff. And even though this plan never became law, the logic here is absolutely key. It ties stimulus directly to one specific number, the unemployment rate. The plan was super simple. If unemployment hits, say 6%, boom, a payment goes out. If it gets even worse, boom, another one follows. It just shows you how central that single data point is to the whole discussion. Okay, so let's shift gears and look at how this plays out in the real world right now. How does a slowing economy actually turn into money in your bank account? This is the typical chain reaction. And man, it usually happens fast. It all starts with that rapid economic contraction. And in response, lawmakers don't just act, they act big. They scramble to pass these enormous spending bills. Once a bill gets passed, a small slice of that massive pie is carved out and sent directly to us, the consumers. And it's all for one reason: to get people spending again and restart that economic engine. And it's so important to remember this. The checks themselves are almost never a standalone thing. They're usually just one piece of these gigantic, multi-billion, sometimes trillion-dollar packages with these big, sweeping names. The direct payments, they're kind of like the little bone thrown to regular folks inside these much, much larger spending bills.
I love this old stock market saying because it perfectly captures why lawmakers have to move so fast. You know, an economy usually grows pretty slowly, methodically, like walking up a flight of stairs. But when it falls fast, like an elevator with the cables cut. It's that sudden, sharp drop that creates the urgency, the political pressure to pass something, anything, quickly.
So, here's another way to look at it, and it's a bit more controversial. Some economists actually see recessions as a totally normal, maybe even necessary, part of the business cycle. They call it a big old reset, a chance to clear out the old, inefficient stuff and make way for new growth. From this point of view, stimulus checks aren't really about stopping the reset, but more about cushioning the fall for everybody during that painful, but maybe inevitable transition. Okay, so we've got all these moving parts, all this data, GDP, inflation, consumer sentiment. So if you want to know what the real chances are of another stimulus, it really just comes down to one number. There is one indicator that stands head and shoulders above the rest in predicting what the government will do next. It gives us the clearest, most immediate picture of what's happening to the economy's health right now.
And that number is, you guessed it, the unemployment rate. This is the 30,000-foot view. It tells you, in really broad strokes, whether the country is growing or shrinking.
So why does this one number matter so much? Well, because a rising unemployment rate kicks off a really nasty, vicious cycle. Businesses start cutting jobs because their revenue is shrinking. But that means people have less money to spend, which, you guessed it, shrinks business revenue even more. It's a downward spiral, and lawmakers try to use stimulus to break that cycle. That's why a consistently rising unemployment rate is, without a doubt, the most important catalyst to watch. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. If a weak economy is what triggers financial help, does that mean we actually have to go through a painful economic reset for widespread relief to even become possible? It's a really complicated question about the tangled relationship between collective hardship and government help.
Today, we're not going to be talking about politics. We're not going to get bogged down in economic theory or fiscal policy. No, this explainer is all about the human story. We're going to explore what happens on the inside a person, inside a family, when a little bit of help shows up at exactly the right moment. This is all about the emotional impact of stimulus.
You know, this quote it gets right to the heart of everything. For millions of people, a direct payment isn't some abstract idea they hear about on the news. It's real, it's tangible. It's that feeling of a weight just lifting off your chest. It's the sound of an exhale you didn't even realize you were holding in. It's permission to stop panicking, even if it's just for a little while. And that's really the core of what we're looking at today, how money like this translates directly into peace of mind.
So before we can really understand that feeling of relief, we have to talk about the burden it replaces. And that burden, It's the constant, crushing weight of financial worry. It's this silent stress that just follows you everywhere, and it affects every single part of your life in ways that, frankly, people who haven't been there can't fully understand.
I want you to just pause and really think about this for a second. What does it actually physically and mentally feel like? Because it's not just about the numbers in your bank account, right? It's this deeply personal, visceral experience that takes a massive toll.
It's a physical thing, that knot that ties up your stomach, or lying wide awake at 3 a.m. with your mind just racing, going over the same problems again and again. It puts a huge strain on our relationships, sparking arguments with the people we love, and that quiet heartbreak of having to tell your kids no. And this isn't just in your head. Study after study directly links this constant state of worry to depression, to anxiety, and even to high blood pressure. It just wears you down, body and soul. And then something shifts. A little notification pops up on your phone. A deposit hits your account. And in that one single moment, that whole storm of worry just breaks. And this incredible feeling of relief washes over you. So let's look at what that moment really meant for actual people.
So, let's hear it straight from the people whose lives were changed. Their stories, well, they're the most powerful way to illustrate this impact.
Just try to put yourself in Sarah's shoes for a minute. For months, she was living with the terrifying possibility of eviction hanging over her family's head. That's not just a financial problem, that's a threat to her kids' fundamental safety and stability. So that money, it didn't just clear her debt with the landlord, it cleared the fear from her mind. It gave her the ability to sleep through the night again, knowing her kids had a safe place to call home. You can't put a price tag on that.
Mike's story here shows us something absolutely crucial. Agency, the ability to act. He was completely trapped. He wanted to work, he was out there looking, but a simple, practical problem, a broken down car, was standing in his way. So the stimulus wasn't a handout for him, it was a tool. It was the key that unlocked his ability to go out and solve his own problem. It empowered him to keep fighting for his future, and it restored not just his transportation, but his sense of control over his own life.
And here, with Maria, we see maybe the most direct link of all. For so many seniors on a fixed income, rising costs create these impossible choices. I mean, do you buy your groceries for the week or do you buy your heart medication? The stimulus check took that impossible choice off the table. This wasn't about luxury. For her, it was about life and death. It was a direct investment in her physical health, allowing her to afford the basic care she needed to live.
Now, these individual stories are incredibly powerful, right? But the impact doesn't just stop with one bill getting paid. That initial moment of relief, it actually sets off a chain reaction, a positive ripple effect that starts to touch every other part of a person's life. It's this incredible cascade of relief. So first, the immediate threat is gone. The rent is paid, the panic subsides. That creates step 2, breathing room. Your brain can finally shift out of that constant fight or flight crisis mode. And from there, you can actually move to step 3. You start planning for the future instead of just trying to survive today. And all of this leads to this profound confidence boost, that feeling of being back in control, of feeling more like yourself again. It's a total pivot from fear to empowerment.
Okay, so the stories and the feelings, that's the real heart of this. But it's also super important to ground all of this in some hard data. Because the numbers, they don't just quantify the economic impact. They actually help quantify the very emotional relief that we've been talking about.
So let's just use the 2021 stimulus as an example. For a family of 4, the total payment could be around $5,600. I mean, just look at that number. That is not a small amount of money. For a family that's living paycheck to paycheck, a sum like this is absolutely monumental. It is a game changer. But what does that actually mean in real-world terms?
This right here, this illustrates the massive scale of that impact. For so many families, that number doesn't just mean a small luxury, it's completely transformative. We're talking about half a year of rent, a full year of car payments, or 6 to 8 months of groceries. That's the power to wipe out crippling utility debt in a single moment, providing a genuine foundation to get stable again.
And the data connects right back to the emotions. I mean, these numbers show a staggering improvement in well-being. Look at this. 78% of people reported feeling less anxiety. 72% got a better night's sleep. And this one is huge. 81% said it reduced tension in their relationships. That's more than 4 out of 5 families arguing less about money, being able to connect on a human level again. This is powerful, powerful proof that financial stability is a cornerstone of our emotional and relational health.
So, as we've seen through all the stories and all the data, this goes so much deeper than just economics. We've paid the bills, we've calmed the anxiety, but if we boil all of this down to its purest, simplest form, What is the true, fundamental power of this kind of assistance?
Let's just ask that question directly. After everything we've looked at, the relief, the ripple effect, the restored peace of mind, what is the single most important thing that a stimulus check really provides?
It's this. One word. Hope. In a world that can feel so overwhelming and isolating sometimes, hope is the fuel that keeps us all going. And that, more than anything else, is what this represents.
But what kind of hope are we talking about? Well, it's the hope that your current struggle isn't permanent. It's the belief in a better future, that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe, most importantly, it's the hope that comes from feeling seen. It's a signal from the world that someone recognizes you're struggling, that your hardship matters, and that you haven't been completely left behind or forgotten. And that brings us to this final, crucial thought. If you're going through this, if you know what that weight of worry feels like, I just want you to remember this. You are not alone. Millions of people understand what you're feeling. Your worth is not defined by your bank balance. And that desire for dignity, for security, for a little peace of mind, that is a universal human need. This entire explainer has really just been about one thing, showing that a little help isn't just about the money. It's about validating our shared humanity. And that is a powerful message of hope for all of us.
Today, we're talking stimulus checks, but probably not in the way you're used to thinking about them. We usually see them as, a little bit of help, some financial relief. But what if that's just scratching the surface? Seriously, we're about to dive into what this money really is, and I promise you've never thought about it like this before. All right, so let's just start with a simple question to kind of shift our perspective. For just a second, try to forget everything you know or assume about this money, and just ask yourself, what if this thing, this direct deposit hitting your account, what if it wasn't just a check? What if it was something else entirely? Because, well, it is something else. It's a tool. It's an instrument that gives you real economic influence. And in this explainer, I'm going to show you exactly how that's not just some cool-sounding phrase. Nope, it's a real, measurable, economic fact. You're about to find out just how much power you're actually holding. Okay, let's get right into it. The very first superpower we need to talk about, it's a concept economists have known about for ages, but honestly, most of us have never heard of it. It's called the stimulus multiplier. And this is the secret sauce. It's how your check becomes way, way more than just the number printed on it. So yeah, this is the big idea right here, the multiplier effect. It's like this economic magic trick that happens the moment you spend your money. I mean, think about it, right? You go spend $1 at your local coffee shop. That dollar doesn't just disappear. The shop owner uses it to pay the barista. Then the barista uses it to buy groceries. The grocery store uses it to pay their stocker. And it just keeps going and going and going. Your $1 is out there working, moving, creating value long after you've spent it. And what's really wild is that economists can actually calculate this ripple effect. They use this surprisingly simple idea that has a super fancy name, the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. Now, don't let that name scare you off. It's really just a simple question. For every new dollar you get, how much of it are you going to spend right away, and how much are you going to save? So when it comes to stimulus checks, the average MPC is around 0.35. What does that mean? It means for every dollar that comes in, people spend about 35 cents of it almost immediately. The rest might go to savings or paying down debt, and that's important too. But that 35 cents, that's the spark. That's what gets the whole economic fire going. Okay, so we've got the basic idea, and we've got the key number. Now let's put them together and see how this creates something, well, something huge. This is where it gets really, really cool. So let's take a real number, like a $1,400 stimulus check. Picture that as the very first domino you're about to tip over. Okay, so when you run the numbers, and the formula is basically built around that 35-cent spending habit we talked about, you get a multiplier of about 1.54. So you take your $1,400, you multiply it by 1.54, and what do you get? $2,156. Just let that sink in for a second. Your check's real impact on the economy isn't $1,400. It's over $2,000. You didn't just get help. You injected over $2,000 of economic energy into your community. And that brings us to your next superpower, speed. Because it turns out it's not just that you spend the money, it's how fast you spend it. That's what makes stimulus such an incredible kickstarter for the economy. So let's look at why your spending is the catalyst here. Yeah, economists have a term for this too. They call it spending velocity. And the best way to think about it is like a pond versus a river. Money just sitting in a savings account, that's a stagnant pond. It's not really doing much. But money that's being spent quickly, that's a powerful river. It's moving, it's circulating, it's creating energy everywhere it flows. And stimulus money, especially when it lands in the hands of people who really need it, that's one of the fastest flowing rivers there is.
And this chart just lays it out perfectly. I mean, look at this. Data from the pandemic stimulus checks showed a super clear pattern. In just 10 days, folks in low-income households had spent almost half their check, 44.5%, on things they needed right away. Middle-income families? About a quarter. High-income households? Barely 10%. They just didn't need it for immediate stuff. And that's why targeting stimulus matters so much. You put the money in the hands of the people who will get it flowing the fastest.
Let's trace the journey of, say, $100. You decide to take the family out to a local restaurant. Okay, step one. The owner takes that $100 and uses it to pay a server and buy some fresh produce from a local farmer. That's step two. Now, that server takes her pay and gets a haircut down the street, and the farmer buys some new tools at the local hardware store. Step three. See what's happening? All these other local businesses are getting a piece of the action. Your one decision to eat out created a whole wave of opportunity for tons of other people in your town.
So here's the most important part. None of this is random. You are the one calling the shots. That means you can be strategic. You can choose to make your impact even bigger. This isn't just about spending money. It's about spending it with a purpose. Let's open up the playbook.
All right, play number one. Check this out. Studies show that when you spend $1 at a big national chain store, about $1.20 of economic activity stays local. Okay, that's not bad. But get this, when you spend that exact same dollar at a locally owned shop, it creates about $1.80 in local activity. That is a 50% bigger impact. Why the difference? It's simple. Local owners live where you live. They use local banks, hire local people. They're part of the same ecosystem. So your choice of where to grab a coffee literally changes the financial outcome for your neighborhood. But what about bills? What if you have to pay down debt? A lot of people think that's like an economic black hole, that the money just disappears. But that's not true at all. It's actually a huge power move. Think about it. When you pay down a high-interest credit card, you are giving your future self a raise. Let's say you knock out a $1,000 debt that has 20% interest. Boom. You just saved yourself $200 a year. That's $200 that is now free to be spent year after year. It becomes part of your regular cash flow, feeding right back into that local economy. It's a multiplier that pays off for a long, long time.
And you know, for those in a position to do so, there's an even more powerful long-term move, investing. And I'm not talking about the stock market. I'm talking about investing in you. Using some of that money for a new certification, that could boost your earnings for the rest of your life. Using it to start that side hustle you've been dreaming about, that creates a whole new income stream. Heck, even putting it into new energy-efficient windows for your house, that lowers your bills forever. These are the kinds of choices that build real, lasting economic power.
Okay, let's talk about the final superpower. This is the one that most people completely miss, and it goes way beyond just your own bank account. This one has the power to lift up your whole community.
This is so fascinating. We never really talk about this, but the simple feeling of relief that comes with a stimulus check, that's not just a feeling. It has actual, measurable economic value. Get this, studies show that severe financial stress can tank someone's productivity at work by as much as 20%. It also leads to higher healthcare costs for everybody, so when you reduce that stress, even for a little while, people can focus better, they're more productive, they make smarter decisions. This psychological multiplier helps create a healthier, more effective workforce, and that's a huge hidden win for the whole economy.
So how do you actually use all this? You make a plan. You can literally time your moves to get the biggest bang for your buck. So phase one, the first month, focus on that high-speed spending. Cover your immediate needs, ideally at local spots, and attack that nasty high-interest debt. Phase two, the next couple of months, now you get strategic. You make a conscious effort to support local shops, and just as important, you tell other people about this stuff. Then phase three, the long game, you take that extra cash flow you created by paying off debt, and you use it for more local spending or those smart personal investments. It's a step-by-step plan to becoming an economic power player.
And that really brings us to the single most important takeaway here. Once you understand all this, the multiplier effect, spending velocity, the power of buying local, everything changes. You're not just some passive person getting a handout. No, you are an active, crucial part of a really sophisticated economic engine. The entire system relies on your choices, where you spend your money, when you spend it, what you buy, to create those positive ripples that benefit everyone. Your role is not passive, it is active.
And that, right there, is your superpower.
You've probably wondered how government stimulus programs actually work, right? Well, today, we're pulling back the curtain and breaking down the entire system. We're giving you the insights you need to really understand it, and even navigate it. Think of this less as an explanation, and more as your personal playbook. Okay, so that sounds a little dramatic, I know, but it gets to the very heart of what we're talking about today. This isn't about some wild conspiracy theory. It's about understanding the predictable mechanics behind a really complex system, seeing the patterns, the timing, and the formulas that, honestly, most people never even notice.
And that right there, that's the goal. By the time we're done here, you're going to understand the why and the when behind stimulus checks. It's all about shifting you from just being a passive recipient to someone who is prepared, informed, and ready. So let's dive in. First things first, we've got to look backwards to see what's ahead. It turns out these big stimulus programs aren't just random acts of kindness from the government. Nope. Our analysis shows this remarkably predictable pattern that has played out during almost every major economic crisis in recent history. Understanding this cycle is your first real advantage.
This right here maps out the entire life cycle. It all kicks off with an economic trigger, a recession, a pandemic, something big. Then you get this weird denial phase, where officials might try to downplay it, but that always shifts to recognition, and that's followed by a frantic legislative sprint to pass a bill. Only then do we get to the distribution and, hopefully, the recovery. If you can figure out which phase we're in, you can start to anticipate what's coming months before anyone else.
And this is fascinating because it shows us that stimulus isn't just pure economics. It's got a ton to do with political timing. The data's pretty clear. When unemployment climbs over 6%, the chances of action just skyrocket. Same thing happens in an election year. It's a powerful tool on the campaign trail. So the real takeaway here, you should be watching the monthly job reports and the political calendar just as closely as the economists do. Those are the real tells.
Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about the actual dollar amounts you hear on the news. $1,200, $600, $1,400. You might think they're just pulled out of a hat, right? Well, they're not. There's a real science behind them, a calculated effort to find that perfect economic sweet spot. Let's decode those magic numbers.
So why does a number like $1,400 keep popping up like it did back in 2021? Well, it all comes down to tons of economic research that's identified this amount as basically the sweet spot. It's just enough money to actually change people's spending habits and give the economy a real boost, but it's designed to be just under the point where it might trigger massive runaway inflation. It's the maximum bang for the buck. Now, to really get why $1,400 works, you need to know about this one concept. It sounds fancy, marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, but I promise the idea is super simple. All it means is this: if I give you an extra dollar, how much of it will you immediately go out and spend? The answer to that question is probably the single most important factor for figuring out how effective a stimulus check is actually going to be.
And this chart breaks down what happens to that money. The research shows that people with very little in savings will spend about 45 cents of every new dollar, like right away. For the average person, it's closer to 35 cents. The rest, it usually gets saved or used to pay off some debt. This data is exactly why stimulus is often targeted. The government knows that getting money to the people who will spend it the fastest is the key to kickstarting the economy.
Now let's talk about timing. What a lot of people don't realize is that a stimulus payment has a shelf life. It's kind of like a shot of adrenaline for the economy. For the first 3 months, you get the biggest positive impact. But after that, the benefits start to fade and the worries about inflation start to creep in. This 6-month window is absolutely critical. It explains why sometimes we see multiple rounds of stimulus spaced about half a year apart. They're trying to keep hitting that sweet spot before the downsides take over.
Okay, so we've covered the when and the how much. Now let's get to the part I'm sure you really care about. How do you get it? See, the IRS has a very clear, very methodical distribution hierarchy. And knowing where you are in this pecking order is the absolute key to getting your money as fast as humanly possible.
The order is simple and it's absolute. At the very top of the list, the VIPs of stimulus are people who have direct deposit information on file with the IRS. They can see that money in just a matter of days. Next up are federal beneficiaries, like folks on Social Security. And way at the back of the line, waiting weeks longer, are the people who get paper checks or debit cards. The takeaway here couldn't be clearer. Direct deposit is king.
Now, your eligibility isn't just a simple yes or no. It's based on your adjusted gross income, your AGI, from your last tax return. And as you can see, there are some pretty clear cliffs.
If you're a single filer, you get the full amount up to $75,000. But for every dollar you earn over that, the payment starts to shrink until it just disappears. Knowing these numbers lets you strategize. For someone who's just a little bit over a threshold, a simple move like bumping up a retirement contribution could lower their AGI and suddenly make them eligible for the whole thing.
So, we've unpacked the patterns, we've decoded the numbers, and we've looked at the distribution system. Now let's get to the final and I think most important part, turning all of this knowledge into a real personal strategy that you can actually use to maximize your benefit and get ready for whatever's next.
To build that strategy, let's start with just a single dollar. When the government sends you $1 of stimulus, its journey is just getting started. It actually sets off this incredible chain reaction throughout the economy, something economists call the multiplier effect.
And thanks to that multiplier effect, your one little stimulus dollar actually creates about $1.54 in total economic activity. How? Well, you spend it at a local restaurant. The owner then uses that dollar to pay their supplier. The supplier then pays their employee. See? That single dollar gets spent over and over again. And the source material points out that you can make this even more powerful by consciously spending that money at local businesses, keeping it flowing right there in your own community.
But, and this is a big but, it's so important to understand the trade-off here. Stimulus gives that immediate, often necessary relief, but it can also lead to inflation down the road, which we all saw happen after 2021. So the key takeaway for your personal strategy is that when you get a payment, it's probably pretty smart to also prepare for the possibility of higher prices on things like gas and groceries in the months that follow. So what can you do? Like right now? Here it is, a simple 3-step action plan. First, head over to irs.gov and just confirm they have your correct info. Second, if your bank account has changed or you've moved, update it. This is the single biggest thing that affects how quickly you get paid. And third, and this is a big one a lot of people miss, even if you have zero income to report and you don't owe any taxes, file a simple return. It gets you in the system, it puts you on the list, it makes sure you don't get overlooked.
So, let's just bring it all home. This is your new advantage. You're no longer just sitting around waiting for the news to tell you what's happening. You can now anticipate when a stimulus might be coming just by watching those key triggers. You know the exact steps to take to get it faster than most people. You understand the logic behind how much you might get, and you know how to use it effectively to help yourself and your community. You have the whole picture now.
So there you have it. We've just handed you the insider's playbook. You now have a deep understanding of the patterns, the numbers, the systems, and the strategies behind economic stimulus. And that knowledge, that's power. The only question left is, now that you can see what's coming, how are you going to use it?
Let's talk about the one thing that is on just about everybody's mind: stimulus checks. You know, is more help actually on the way? We've been digging through all the source material to get you some real answers about whether another check is coming, how much it could be, and maybe most importantly, what you can do about it right now. So let's just cut right to the chase. This is the big question, isn't it? Are we really getting more stimulus checks? Okay, here's how we're going to break this all down for you. First, we'll look at how likely more stimulus is. Then, the fun part, what a potential check could actually look like. We'll also get into why this whole thing is so complicated, inflation and all that. And we'll wrap up with what you can actually do to get prepared. First step is more stimulus coming. Let's get the honest, no-fluff answer. Look, the most honest answer is nobody knows for sure because nothing's been signed into law. But, and this is a big but, that definitely doesn't mean it's a no. There are absolutely reasons to be hopeful. And more importantly, there are some really key signs you can watch for that could signal help is on the way. So what exactly should we be looking for? Well, the sources point to 4 main signals. If you start seeing headlines about widespread layoffs, rising unemployment, or the stock market taking a big dip, those are all huge economic red flags. And the 4th one, it's political. You gotta listen to the language. When politicians start talking less about the deficit and more about helping people, that's usually when the talk starts turning into action. And this really gets to the heart of the issue, right? On one hand, you've got reasons for hope. It's an election year, and history shows us that politicians are way more likely to act when the economy looks weak. But then there's the caution side, the reality check. Right now, these are just proposals. No check has actually been approved. And if the economy bounces back on its own, all that pressure to send out more money could just evaporate. Okay, now for the part I know everyone is really waiting for. Let's talk about the money. If a check does come, how much could we be talking about, and who would actually get it?
History actually gives us some really powerful clues here. If you look at the pattern, the payments have been growing over time. Back in 2008, it was around $600. By 2021, we were at $1,400 per person. So a pretty clear trend has been set, and that trend is up. So where does that trend lead? Well, based on the source material, a lot of experts think the next number could land somewhere between that last $1,400 mark and $2,000 per person. I mean, stop and think about that for a second. For a family of 4, that could be an $8,000 check. That is absolutely life-changing money. And here's the really good news. These payments are almost always designed to help a broad range of people. We're talking about folks who work and pay taxes, retirees on Social Security, people who are unemployed, and of course, families with kids. You don't have to be living in poverty to qualify. Most middle-class households have been included in the past. The whole point is to help regular, everyday people.
So this all leads to the big question. If people need help and there's a history of giving it, what's the holdup? Well, it really boils down to 2 huge complications: the fear of inflation and just a massive flood of misinformation out there.
Okay, first, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with inflation. All it really means is that your dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. The prices for everything, gas, groceries, you name it, they go up, and your money just buys less. This is the #1 reason opponents of more stimulus bring up. But was stimulus really the main villain? Well, the source material shows it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. You had massive supply chain problems, soaring energy costs, and a lot of companies just hiking up their prices. So stimulus was a factor, for sure, but it wasn't the whole story. And this is the debate policymakers are having. How do you help people who are hurting without making prices go up even more?
And then there's the other big problem: misinformation. I mean, come on, you've seen posts like this all over your social media feed, right? They're designed to prey on your hope, on your desperation. And let's be real, they are almost always fake. And a lot of times they're straight up dangerous scams. So how do you protect yourself from this stuff? It's pretty simple. Be skeptical. Real official announcements will come from official places, like IRS.gov. It'll be on every major news network. If some random post promises you $5,000 a month, it's probably not real. And whatever you do, never, ever click on suspicious links. All this waiting and wondering, it can make you feel pretty powerless, but you're not. So let's shift gears. Let's talk about what you can actually do right now to put yourself in the best possible position. Here is a simple 4-step action plan. The first 2 are all about making it easy for the government to pay you. Go to the IRS website and make sure your address and bank info are up to date. And file your taxes, even if you have 0 income and don't owe anything. Third, stay informed, but stick to reliable news sources. And finally, use your voice. Let your elected representatives know that you need help. It really does make a difference. Oh, and a super important side note here: if you think you might have missed out on that big payment from 2021, you might still be able to get it. It's called the Recovery Rebate Credit, and you claim it by filing a 2021 tax return. But you have got to act fast because that window to claim it is closing. Now, if a payment does get approved, having a plan for that money is everything. The sources suggest this priority list. Start with survival stuff: rent, food, keeping the lights on. Then immediately attack any high-interest debt: credit cards, payday loans, the stuff that's costing you money every single month. After that, build up some security, like a small emergency fund. Look, this isn't about being told what to do. It's just a smart strategy to turn that money into real, lasting stability. I really want to end with this thought because it's just so important to remember. If you're feeling that financial pressure, if you're worried about how you're going to make it to the end of the month, please know you are not alone in this. Millions and millions of your neighbors are going through the exact same thing, just hoping for a little bit of help. And that brings us to our last question, the one we want to leave you with. We've talked about the signs, the politics, the numbers, the scams, and how to prepare. So now it gets personal. If that money comes through, what's your plan? Seriously, having an answer to that question is maybe the most powerful thing you can do. Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating new study that completely rethinks those stimulus checks a lot of us received a few years back. It asks a really simple but powerful question. Was there a much smarter way to handle that economic rescue? The answer? Well, it might just change how we think about this stuff forever. Let's get into it. Yeah, you remember it, right? Seeing that direct deposit hit your bank account during what was a really, really uncertain time. For a lot of folks, it was an absolute lifeline.
For others, well, maybe it just went straight into savings. This new research suggests that by being a lot more deliberate about who gets the money, we could create a system that's not just more powerful, but a whole lot more efficient too.
So to really understand this new proposal, we first have to rewind and look at the old one. Economists have been digging through mountains of data from those 3 big stimulus rounds, and they found some pretty big problems with that money for everyone approach. Let's unpack what they learned. Okay, so the first issue was just the sheer scale of it all. Checks went out to 85% of the entire US population. Think about that. The goal was to get money into the economy fast, no questions asked, but the study argues this was like using a fire hose to water a houseplant. It was just way, way too broad.
And, of course, that super broad approach came with a truly colossal price tag. We're talking about roughly $850 billion with a B. That's an incredible amount of money. And when you're spending that kind of cash, you really, really want every single dollar to count. According to this research, a lot of those dollars simply didn't.
And here's maybe the biggest unintended consequence of them all. All that cash flooding the system at once contributed about 3 percentage points to the inflation that we've all been feeling. You can almost hear the whoops moment in the research. Sending so much money to so many people, a lot of whom didn't need to spend it right away, just helped pour fuel on the fire of rising prices. So the takeaway is pretty clear. It was incredibly expensive, inefficient, and it came with that inflationary sting in the tail.
Okay, so if blanketing the entire country with cash isn't the best way to go, what is? Well, the answer lies in a really simple but incredibly powerful economic idea. It all comes down to understanding the fundamental difference between 2 types of people, the spender and the saver. Now, the fancy official term for this is the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. I know, sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. All it means is this. If I give you an extra $1, what are you most likely to do with it? Are you going to go out and spend it pretty much immediately? Or are you going to stick it in the bank or maybe pay down some debt? That simple question is the absolute key to unlocking a smarter stimulus. So let's break this down. On one side, you have people with a high MPC. These are typically your low-income folks, people on a fixed income. When they get some extra cash, it immediately gets spent on necessities. We're talking rent, groceries, gas for the car. It gets put right back into the economy. On the other side, you have people with a low MPC. These are usually higher income individuals. When they get an extra check, they're far more likely to save it, invest it, maybe pay off a credit card bill. That money doesn't really move. For a stimulus to actually work, you need spenders, not savers. It's that simple.
So, how do you take this idea of MPC and turn it into an actual concrete plan? Well, this is where the study gets really exciting. It suggests a completely different strategy. Instead of small checks for everyone, it proposes larger, ongoing checks for a very, very specific group of people. And here it is. The proposal is for ongoing $2,000 monthly checks. But the most important word on this slide is only. These payments would be hyper-focused, going exclusively to those low-income, high-MPC individuals, the people who are guaranteed to put that money right back into circulation. It's like switching from a shotgun to a laser beam.
And the data on this is just crystal clear. The study found that when a high MPC person gets that $2,000, their spending is incredibly fast and predictable. About $1,600, that's 80%, is spent within the first 10 days. The rest of it is gone within a month. This is exactly what you want for economic stimulus. The money doesn't just sit there, it moves, it creates a ripple effect, paying for groceries, car repairs, new shoes for the kids, you name it. You know, it all just comes back to the original goal. The source material puts it perfectly. We're not looking for savers, we're looking for spenders. The entire point is to get money moving, to stimulate the economy. And to do that, you have to give it to the people who are actually going to spend it. It's right there in the name.
So when you put it all together, you take the lessons from the past and you apply this logic of MPC, you end up with a proposal that the study argues is just better from every angle. It's smarter, it's cheaper, and it's way more effective. Let's just recap the huge advantages of this kind of targeted strategy. The advantages are pretty amazing when you lay them out. First, you get a much bigger bang for your buck, a greater stimulative effect because the money is actually spent, not hoarded. Because of that incredible efficiency, the total cost would be significantly less than that $850 billion program from before. But just as important, it sends meaningful, ongoing support directly to the people who are struggling the most, all while avoiding the waste of sending checks to people who just save it. It really is a win from every single angle.
And that really leaves us with the big final question, doesn't it? We've seen the flaws of the old model and the compelling logic of this new one. This idea of moving away from these broad, universal payments toward highly focused, targeted financial support, it could be a major turning point in how governments respond to economic crises. It really feels like a blueprint for a future where help isn't just more generous for those who need it most, but a whole lot smarter for the economy as a whole.
You know, we hear all these huge economic headlines, but what do they actually mean for us, for our families? Today, we're digging into exactly that. What happens when massive government stimulus policies land right in your bank account? We're going to break down how it all translates into real-world impact and go way beyond the numbers you see on the news.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down for you. We'll start with those mind-boggling big numbers and funnel it down to a single household budget. Then we'll get into the human impact, see exactly where the money went, talk about making that impact stick, and wrap up with what it all means for policy that's really about people.
All right, let's dive right in. The main idea here is to connect the dots, between this massive, abstract government policy and the very real-world situation of paying your bills every month. So you turn on the news, right? And you hear these numbers, hundreds of billions, sometimes trillions of dollars. I mean, they're so huge they don't even feel real. It's a scale that feels totally disconnected from our day-to-day lives, almost like something out of a textbook, instead of a force that's actually shaping our communities. So, how do we bring these astronomical figures down to earth, to the conversations happening around the kitchen table? The real question is, how does a trillion-dollar policy turn into something that actually helps you cover rent, buy your groceries, or finally get the car fixed? That's where this story gets really personal and, frankly, really interesting. Okay, let's put a real number on this. During one of the stimulus rounds, a typical family of four could have gotten a single payment of $5,600. Now, for some people, that's a nice little cushion. But for millions and millions of families, a sum like this isn't just helpful. It was an absolute game changer that could completely reshape their finances for months to come. And look at what that money really means. Based on national averages, that $5,600 isn't just a number. It's almost 5 months of rent. That's housing security. It's 7 months of food on the table. It's over a year of keeping the lights on. All of a sudden, that one-time payment represents real, tangible stability, a moment to finally breathe. Okay, so having that financial breathing room is huge. But the impact, well, it goes way deeper than just balancing a checkbook. It has these profound personal effects on our actual well-being. And, the data is super clear on this. The relief isn't felt equally by everyone. For the most financially vulnerable groups, it was an absolute lifeline. Think about low-income households living paycheck to paycheck. That money got spent almost immediately on things they desperately needed. For seniors on a fixed income, it might have meant not having to choose between medication and food. For someone who'd lost their job, it was a bridge to finding new work. And for families with kids, well, it helped cover all those endless extra costs. And this, right here, gets to the absolute heart of it. It's not just about the money, it's about mental and emotional health. Nearly 8 out of every 10 people said they felt less anxiety about paying their bills. That is a massive psychological shift. It's like a heavy weight just being lifted off their shoulders. And that feeling of relief, it creates this incredible ripple effect through a person's entire life. When you're not in constant crisis mode, you sleep better, your mental health improves. We all know financial stress can strain relationships, so easing that burden can actually make families stronger. And since that chronic stress takes a physical toll, this relief can even lead to better health. People are just freed up to think more clearly and make better decisions for their future. So we know who benefited and how it made them feel, but where did all that money actually go? What did people spend it on? Looking at the spending patterns gives us this crucial insight into what people really needed in that moment. Well, the answer is pretty clear. Overwhelmingly, the funds went straight to the absolute essentials. The biggest piece of the pie went to things like housing, food, and utilities. The next biggest, paying down debt, especially that high-interest credit card debt that can trap families for years. After that, we saw people catching up on things they'd put off, like fixing a broken fridge or getting essential car repairs. And finally, some of it went into savings, building a small buffer for the next emergency. And this is so important to understand. The spending doesn't just stop with the person who got the check. It creates what you could call a personal multiplier effect. When you use that money to pay your rent, you're helping your landlord pay their mortgage. When you buy groceries, you're supporting that local store and its employees.
That spending helps stabilize the entire local economy from the ground up.
Of course, it's also true that a dollar isn't a dollar everywhere in the country, right? The same amount of money can have a wildly different impact depending on where you live. In a super expensive city like New York or LA, a $1,400 check might not even cover a single month's rent. It helps for sure, but its power is limited. But in a rural town or a smaller city, that same amount could cover rent or utilities for several months, making it way more transformative for that family.
All right, let's shift gears for a second and talk about something really crucial, the fact that these payments were temporary. A one-time cash infusion is incredibly powerful, but the real question for personal finance is how you turn it into something that lasts. We have to remember what these checks were designed to be. They were a temporary bridge, right? A way to get people through a really tough spot. They were never meant to be an ongoing, permanent solution. And understanding that is totally key to using the money in the smartest way possible. So for a lot of people, the goal was to use this one-time boost to build a stronger foundation for the future. And that usually looks like one of three things. First, building an emergency fund. Even a small one can stop the next unexpected expense from becoming a full-blown crisis. Second, attacking high-interest debt, which frees up your money every single month moving forward. And third, investing in yourself. Maybe a training course or a certification that can boost your earning power for the long haul.
So, after looking at all of this, the numbers, the spending, the personal strategies, what's the big takeaway here? What does it all add up to?
You know, at the end of the day, you have to peel back all the layers of economic theory and political debate. Because behind every single one of these statistics, there's a human story. It's the story of a parent who can finally buy their kid the right school supplies. It's a senior who doesn't have to choose between their medicine and their groceries. It's a family that gets to stay in their home.
And that really leaves us with one big question as we look to the future. We've seen just how powerful this kind of direct help can be. So, when the next crisis hits, and there will always be a next one, how do we build on these lessons? How can we design policies that aren't just effective on a spreadsheet, but are truly, deeply, and personally transformative for the people who need that help the most? That's a conversation we need to be having.
So, is another stimulus check on the horizon for 2025? Man, it's a question that's just swimming in rumors and speculation online. Today, we're going to cut through all that noise and give you the real, fact-based answers you're looking for.
All right, this is the big one, isn't it? It's the question that's on pretty much everyone's mind, and it's probably why you're here. So let's not waste any time. Let's just get right to it.
Okay, let's be crystal clear about this right from the start. As of right now, no new federal stimulus payment has been approved. I know you might see stuff floating around on social media, but the bottom line is Congress has not passed any new laws to send out more direct payments. So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll start out the facts from the fiction. Then we're going to dive into the key economic numbers that lawmakers are watching. We'll also look at what it would actually take to trigger new payments. After that, we'll walk you through the whole process, from a bill to your bank account, and we'll wrap up with what you can do to be ready.
Okay, first things first, let's get a really clear picture of what's happening right now. It is so easy to get swept up in all the online chatter, so it's absolutely crucial to know the difference between what's official and what's just, well, noise.
And this really is the key takeaway at the federal level. Congress hasn't passed a thing, but, and this is a really interesting twist, that isn't the whole story. You know, while the conversation in D.C. has pretty much stalled, the idea of direct payments is still very much alive in the states. I mean, we've seen places like New York, California, and Georgia all issue their own relief. So that tells you there's still a real appetite for this kind of support. It's just happening on a more local level for now.
So if nothing's happening, the big question is, why? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the economic data, the same numbers that lawmakers and economists are staring at every single day. These numbers are really the foundation for any decision, so let's get into them.
First, let's talk about jobs. Right now, the unemployment rate is sitting in the low 4% range. Now, historically speaking, that's considered pretty healthy. Sure, it's ticked up a little bit, but it is nowhere near the kind of distrust level that would normally have Washington sounding the alarm bells for emergency action.
And what about inflation? Remember when it felt like prices were just skyrocketing on everything? Well, things have cooled off a lot. Inflation is now down around 2.4%, which is way closer to the Federal Reserve's 2% target. This takes a lot of the urgency away because the economy isn't running red hot anymore.
And the overall economy? We look at something called the gross domestic product, or GDP for that, and it's projected to grow just over 2%. Now, the most important part of that sentence is the word grow.
The economy is expanding, not shrinking. We are not in a recession, which is almost always the starting point for this kind of massive stimulus.
This chart right here really puts it all into perspective. See that bar on the left? That's us right now, with unemployment around 4.2%. Now look at the bar on the right. That represents the historical danger zone, that 6 to 7% level where Congress has traditionally felt like they have to step in and do something. You can see there's a pretty big gap between where we are today and a full-blown crisis.
Okay, so if the economy is chugging along, what could possibly change all this? What are the specific events or economic shifts that could suddenly put stimulus checks right back on the front burner in Washington?
You're going to want to keep an eye out for these 4 potential game changers. First, if unemployment starts climbing and crosses that 6% threshold we just talked about. Second, a huge drop in the stock market could totally wreck consumer confidence. Third, some kind of major geopolitical crisis or a massive natural disaster could send a shockwave through the economy. And finally, well, never ever underestimate election year politics. Stimulus checks tend to be pretty popular with voters.
You know, the whole debate is really complex, and there are good arguments on both sides. People who are for it will tell you that a lot of families are still really struggling, and that direct payments could stop a slowdown from becoming a recession. But on the other side, opponents will point to the stable economy and the gigantic national debt, and they'll argue that more stimulus would just pour gasoline on the fire of inflation.
So let's imagine one of those triggers actually happens. How does an idea for a check become actual money that you can spend? Let's pull back the curtain on that process. It's a long road with a lot of steps.
It all kicks off with the economic data. The numbers have to look bad enough for people to agree there's a problem. Then a member of Congress or the president proposes a bill. That bill has to fight its way through committees. If it survives, it goes to the full House and Senate for debates and votes. If, and that's a big if, it passes both, it finally goes to the president to be signed into law. Only then does the IRS get the green light for the final step, sending out the money.
And check this out. This timeline shows just how fast that last step can be. Once the political fight is over, the government has gotten incredibly good at this. The first big one, the CARES Act, took about 2 weeks. By the time the American Rescue Plan came around in 2021, money was hitting bank accounts within a week. The big takeaway here is that the system is built and ready to go fast, once a decision is actually made.
So, with everything so up in the air, the best thing you can do is focus on what you can actually control. Really, the most important thing is just to be prepared, whether a stimulus payment ever shows up or not.
Here are 4 simple, really practical steps you can take. First, go to the IRS website and make sure they have your current mailing address and direct deposit info. That is the #1 thing you can do to get paid quickly. Second, file your taxes every year, even if you don't owe anything. This keeps you in the system. Third, get your news from reliable sources and official government websites, not from some random post on social media. And finally, have a plan for what you do with the money, whether it's paying down debt or beefing up your savings.
Okay, we have covered a ton of ground here. The current situation, the economic data, what could change things, the whole process. So after all that, what is the single most important thing you should walk away with?
It's this. Any decision about future stimulus checks will be driven by cold, hard economic data, like unemployment and GDP, not by online rumors. So your best strategy isn't to just cross your fingers and hope for a check. It's to be prepared. Getting your financial house in order is always the smartest move, no matter what happens in Washington. And that brings us to one last, really big idea to chew on. After the massive government response to the pandemic, have direct payments like these become a permanent new tool in the economic toolbox? Is this something we should just expect now, every time the economy stumbles? That right there is the bigger question that's